Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very dangerous, beauty standards. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Rome's love affair with blondes didn't begin in a salon. It began on a battlefield. When Roman legions marched north into Gaul and Germania, they expected to find barbarians covered in mud. What they actually found were towering men and women with skin pale as marble and hair like sunlight. The Romans, who'd spent centuries perfecting the art of arrogance, suddenly discovered something they didn't have: natural blonde hair. To a Roman soldier, these northern tribes were terrifying and fascinating. They screamed, drank from skulls, and somehow still managed to look annoyingly radiant while doing it. Reports from the front lines read less like military dispatches and more like jealous fashion columns. The enemy has golden hair. Stop. It shines in battle. Stop. Send bleach soon. The admiration turned into a business. Every war leaves behind spoils, and for Rome, that now included hair. Slavers and wig merchants began collecting blonde locks from defeated Germanic women, washing them, perfuming them, and selling them in Rome's bustling markets. It was the ancient world's first luxury brand, authentic barbarian blonde. Owning one of these wigs became the ultimate status symbol. Senators' wives strutted through marble courtyards wearing golden curls that used to belong to someone who'd tried to kill their husbands. Fashion in Rome was always a little ironic, and occasionally war crime adjacent. The poor tried to keep up, of course. Those who couldn't afford imported hair resorted to homemade bleach made from ash, vinegar, and goat fat, a combination that promised beauty but delivered chemical warfare on the scalp. Ancient graffiti suggests the results ranged from radiant gold to patchy despair. Predictably, Rome's poets had opinions. Ovid, never one to miss a scandal, both adored and mocked blonde women. He called them alluring but deceptive, basically the ancient version of "don't trust girls with highlights." The moralists joined in, complaining that Roman women were abandoning tradition for northern vanity, which, to be fair, they were. But then again, so was everyone else. And so, in a glorious act of cultural theft, Rome decided that blonde hair, once barbaric, savage and foreign, was now sophisticated, Roman and divine. It was empire in follicle form. Because nothing says, "we conquered you," quite like wearing your enemy's head, as a hairstyle. To the Roman elite, these wigs were more than fashion. They were trophies. You weren't just wearing a hairstyle, you were wearing victory. A senator's wife with imported blonde curls was sending a message: "My husband kills barbarians, and I wear them." Subtlety wasn't exactly Rome's strong suit. The wigs varied by status. The cheap ones were coarse and smelled faintly of despair. The expensive ones came from carefully selected northern women, premium virgin locks, as one might say if one had no soul. Rich Romans stored them in ivory boxes like holy relics, next to their jewellery and moral decay. There were also men who tried it. A few senators wore blonde wigs to hide balding heads, because nothing says, "I rule the known world," like pretending to be a 20-year-old from Gaul. Others dyed their grey hair with the same mixtures women used, usually ending up orange and mildly flammable. Poets, predictably, had a field day. Juvenal sneered that half the women in Rome had German heads but Roman hearts. It was meant as an insult. They took it as a compliment. The irony, of course, was that while Roman women were busy copying their northern captives, those same barbarians thought the Romans looked ridiculous. Fair hair was natural to them, not a status symbol. Meanwhile, in Rome, it had become the ultimate display of wealth and theft, fashion as conquest, beauty as propaganda. Only in Rome could a scalp double as a social statement. Not every Roman could afford a wig made from the scalp of a defeated barbarian. For the less fortunate, meaning anyone who wasn't married to a senator or emperor, there was another way to go blonde: self-inflicted chemical warfare. Roman beauty manuals offered dozens of recipes for achieving that coveted golden shade. Unfortunately, none of them involved safety. The most common formula was a delightful mix of wood ash, vinegar, goat fat and sulphur, a scent described by one poet as the perfume of regret. It worked by burning the hair until it surrendered. Women would sit in the sun, heads slathered in this sizzling paste, hoping to look divine, and instead emerging like singed scarecrows. Some even imported powder from Germany called sappho, rumoured to lighten hair without pain. It didn't. It just cost more. Romans being Romans, this only made it more popular. Wealthy women competed to see who could achieve the palest shade of blonde without complete scalp collapse. The look became so fashionable that bald patches were considered a minor inconvenience, proof that you were committed to beauty. Public baths were filled with women gossiping about who had the best hairdresser, whose wig line was crooked, and who smelled faintly of goat. Stylists were treated like miracle workers, and some became minor celebrities. The best ones could bleach hair without visible trauma, a rare skill in a world without gloves or conscience. Of course, the men had opinions. Roman poets loved to praise golden-haired maidens while also mocking them for using dye. It's the oldest trick in the misogyny handbook. Invent the standard, then insult women for trying to meet it. Ovid, the eternal flirt, warned lovers to avoid the false blonde. Naturally, this advice came from a man who once got exiled for inappropriate behaviour. Meanwhile, the smell of burnt sulphur and vinegar drifted through the streets of Rome like an invisible sign of ambition. Every shining head of hair had a story, usually one involving mild poisoning and several days of headache. It was vanity, devotion, and chemical warfare rolled into one. The price of beauty in a city where appearance mattered more than comfort, and where fashion was literally a contact sport. If there was one man in ancient Rome who truly understood the chaos of blonde ambition, it was Ovid, poet, gossip, and self-proclaimed expert on romance, beauty, and bad decisions. In a city where everyone pretended to be virtuous and failed spectacularly, Ovid stood out by admitting it. His Ars Amatoria, the art of love, was less a poem and more a guidebook for flirting, seduction, and strategic insincerity. Naturally, he had thoughts about hair colour. According to Ovid, nothing drew a man's attention like golden locks. But also, nothing revealed a woman's deceit faster than fake ones. He adored blondes, just not the ones who worked for it. Classic man. In one of his many contradictory verses, he praised the golden waves that outshine the sun, only to follow it up with a warning. But if they come from a bottle, beware. Translation. He loved the look, but not the effort. It's the ancient Roman version of, I like natural girls. You know, the kind who spend 3 hours looking natural. Ovid's real genius was that he turned Roman hypocrisy into poetry. He teased women for dyeing their hair while writing odes about how irresistible it made them. He mocked vanity but depended on it for inspiration. He was, essentially, Rome's first beauty influencer, posting advice in verse form, probably while avoiding ex-girlfriends at the forum. But his humour didn't sit well with the moral police. Augustus, the emperor who tried to make Rome pure again, found Ovid's romantic escapades less than patriotic. A few too many risque jokes later, and our poetic beauty blogger was exiled to the edge of the empire, where tragically there were far fewer blondes. Even in exile he couldn't resist. He kept writing letters to Rome, wistfully describing the golden-haired girls of the city. You can almost picture him staring at the snow in the Balkans, thinking, this would all be better if someone nearby owned a decent wig. Ovid's exile proved two things. 1. Beauty standards could get you killed. And 2. In Rome, even the poets were slaves to fashion. They mocked it, worshipped it, and ultimately suffered for it. If anyone could turn a beauty trend into state policy, it was Poppaea Sabina. the second wife of Emperor Nero, a woman whose hobbies included luxury, scheming, and staying alive longer than most of Nero's other friends. Poppaea wasn't born blonde, but she quickly understood that in Rome, gold was the colour of divinity. And if the gods weren't handing out the shade naturally, she'd find another way. Her skin was pale, her eyes were sharp, and her hair, courtesy of imported dyes, wigs, and possibly divine patience, gleamed like sunlight filtered through expensive wine. Roman writers adored her beauty and despised her for it, which was usually a good sign that she was doing something right. Tacitus, ever the grump, described her as beautiful beyond all measure, but corrupt to her core, which, translated from historian speak, means she looked incredible and I'm mad about it. Poppaea's beauty regimen became the stuff of legend. She allegedly bathed in donkey milk, wore pearls dissolved in vinegar, and owned enough wigs to start a small rebellion. Her hair was her crown, an emblem of status, seduction, and subtle political warfare. Every curl said, "I control the emperor and you don't." Her influence spread fast. Within months, half of Rome was trying to copy her look: pale skin, golden hair, and an expression that said, "I've ruined 3 men before lunch." Shops overflowed with bleaching powders, imported wigs and bronze mirrors. The city smelled faintly of vinegar, sulphur, and ambition. But being fashionable in Nero's Rome was dangerous. One day you're the empress setting trends. The next, your husband's ordering your death because you criticized his lyre solo. According to legend, Nero struck Poppaea during a fit of rage, ending her life, though some sources claim it was a domestic accident, which is Roman for "we don't want to talk about it." Even in death, she remained an icon. Statues of her showed flowing blonde curls, serene and untouchable. The woman who defined Roman beauty outlasted her empire in marble and myth. Poppaea didn't just go platinum, she weaponized it. And like everything Rome ever loved too much, it ended beautifully and catastrophically. Rome had a special talent. It could turn anything it conquered into a fashion statement, even the people it insulted. The Germans and Gauls had spent decades being called savages by Roman poets, yet their hair became the ultimate luxury item. Civilization, it seems, was only a matter of who wore whose scalp. The irony didn't go unnoticed. To the average Roman moralist, that eternal species of man who disapproves of everything, blonde hair represented corruption, moral decay, and a worrying amount of German influence. To the average Roman woman, it represented fabulousness. It was a cultural paradox in perfect Roman form. Blonde hair was barbarian, but irresistible. The very colour that once meant uncivilized now meant wealthy, seductive, possibly dangerous. It was the same logic that made them worship Greek gods after conquering Greece. Domination through imitation. Every poet and philosopher had an opinion. Seneca, Rome's champion of Stoicism, probably lectured about inner virtue while staring disapprovingly at someone's highlights. Juvenal complained that foreign fashions corrupt Roman virtue. But if you read between the lines, you can tell he noticed a lot of blondes in his neighbourhood. Even Propertius, the romantic pessimist, warned that blonde women were deceptive sirens, which sounds suspiciously like he'd been dumped by one. Meanwhile, the Roman elite turned barbarian into couture. A senator's wife wearing a golden wig wasn't being rebellious, she was displaying power. She was saying, "My husband conquers nations, and I accessorize accordingly." Her hair wasn't blonde because she wanted to look foreign, it was blonde because she could afford to be. Of course, the barbarians didn't care. They weren't reading Roman poetry. They were too busy burning down forts and living rent-free in Roman nightmares. While Rome was arguing about hair colour, Germania was sharpening swords. This was the heart of Roman hypocrisy. They loved the beauty of the people they despised, stole their image, and then called it Roman refinement. It was fashion as conquest, the ultimate transformation of brutality into elegance. So yes, to Rome, blonde meant barbarian, but that didn't stop them from bleaching their heads buying wigs from the north and pretending the colour was native. In the end, nothing was more Roman than stealing what you couldn't naturally grow. Rome, as usual, found a way to turn vanity into theology. If the people wanted to bleach their hair, the gods would just have to agree. And so they did. In art, literature, and imagination, the Romans gradually began giving their deities a makeover. Venus, goddess of love, who in Greek mythology was dark-haired and olive-skinned, slowly evolved into a radiant blonde. Statues and frescoes showed her with sunlit curls, divine, glowing, and conveniently in line with whatever was trending in the forum that week. The logic was simple. If blondes were beautiful, then the goddess of beauty must have blonde hair. Divine endorsement achieved. No council, no vote, just cultural gaslighting on a cosmic level. Soon other figures followed suit. Nymphs, muses, and mythical maidens all started appearing in golden tones. Even Apollo, the golden god of light, was used as justification. See? The gods prefer gold. It was theology by marketing. Rome's pantheon turned into a celestial fashion magazine. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Some old-school moralists argued that dark hair represented virtue, discipline, modesty, proper Roman values. Blondes, on the other hand, represented temptation, luxury, and afternoons spent doing absolutely nothing productive. In other words, heaven. Still, the message stuck. Golden hair was divine hair. Temples even sold charms and oils claiming to brighten the spirit and the strands. Imagine trying to pray while the woman next to you is asking if your shade is natural. The trend reached such absurdity that some women claimed to be born blonde, a biological impossibility in Rome's climate, but truth was flexible when fashion was involved. Men wrote odes to their lovers' sun-touched curls, while very carefully not mentioning that most of those curls were detachable. The gods didn't care. Rome was loud, decadent, and faithful only to appearances. If Venus had to change her hair colour to keep the city happy, so be it. After all, divinity in Rome worked like politics. Whoever looked the part got the worship. In the end, it wasn't the gods who blessed blondes. It was blondes who rebranded the gods. Rome didn't just dye its hair, it dyed heaven. It was only a matter of time before the men got jealous. Rome may have built an empire, but it couldn't resist a good mirror. After decades of mocking women for chasing the golden look, Roman men decided they too would like to resemble northern warlords. Without the frostbite and paganism, it started with the young and vain, the same type of men who spent more time oiling their hair than polishing their armour. Soldiers returning from Germania bragged not just about victories, but about their enemies' hair colour. The women there, one soldier probably said, looked like sunlight itself. And suddenly, every Roman barber was getting suspicious requests that began with, hypothetically, how would one lighten this? Of course, the wealthy led the way. Ambitious men began lightening their hair using the same sulphur and goat fat concoctions as their wives. The results were mixed. Some emerged golden and triumphant. Others looked like overcooked bread. The smell of vinegar and ego filled the air. Even aging statesmen got in on it. Baldness was the great Roman fear, a visible symbol of mortality and lost virility. Julius Caesar famously combed what little hair he had forward, trying to pretend he wasn't losing it. If peroxide had existed, he'd have dunked his head in it before every Senate session. Barbers became as politically important as philosophers. They listened to senators rant about honour while applying imported German hair dust, basically ancient bleach. It didn't just lighten hair, it ate through pride. The moralists, predictably, had a meltdown. "Men are becoming women," they cried, as if that hadn't been happening since the invention of wine. But vanity, like empire, is contagious. Soon, even gladiators were bleaching their curls to attract admirers in the stands. Nothing says masculine fury like shimmering golden highlights under the torchlight. By the time of Emperor Commodus, beauty had become performance. The battlefield and the boudoir were competing theatres, and everyone wanted to shine. Literally. The Romans had conquered the world, but the real war was happening on their heads. In the city that claimed virtue came from discipline, half its citizens were secretly soaking in vinegar just to look more barbarian. And that, in a nutshell, is Roman masculinity. Leather sandals, molten pride, and a faint smell of sulphur. Every empire eventually figures out how to turn sin into spectacle, and Rome, ever the overachiever, did it better than anyone. By the height of the empire, blonde hair wasn't just fashionable, it was advertising. Enter the courtesans, the elegant, scandalous, and tax-paying professionals of Roman nightlife. Many of them were foreigners, Gauls, Germans, Syrians, women brought to Rome by conquest and capitalism. Their hair, naturally lighter than that of Roman women, drew immediate attention. When your profession depended on being noticed, sunlight-coloured hair was the ancient equivalent of a neon sign flashing, "Available tonight." Soon, even Roman-born courtesans began bleaching their hair to match. Not because they wanted to look barbarian, but because it worked. The richer ones imported actual wigs from Germania. The poorer ones just risked chemical burns. In the dim lamplight of the Subura, Rome's seediest district, everyone looked divine anyway. It didn't take long for respectable women to panic. You could always tell who'd visited the wrong apothecary when a senator's wife suddenly appeared in public with a suspiciously new shade of piety blonde. Overnight, hair colour became a moral battlefield. Blondes were sensual, daring, and untrustworthy, which of course made everyone secretly want to be one. Poets and satirists pounced. Juvenal, the eternal grumbler, wrote that you could spot a prostitute by her yellow hair. He meant it as an insult. Roman women heard it as free market research. The temples stayed full, the salons stayed busier, and the hypocrisy stayed perfectly intact. Blonde courtesans even became cultural icons. Some were so famous that men wrote poems to their wigs. Others hosted salons where senators and poets debated philosophy between wine refills. A few even managed to amass fortunes that outlasted the men who paid them. They weren't just survivors. They were entrepreneurs in an age when morality came with a price tag. And yet, society still condemned them while copying their style. The same senators who passed modesty laws were often found at night under the golden curls of the very women those laws targeted. Rome loved to moralize by day and moisturize by night, and nothing captured that better than its blonde courtesans, the true goddesses of contradiction. Every trend in Rome eventually hit the same wall: the moralists. These were the professional killjoys of antiquity, old senators, bitter philosophers, and anyone whose social life had expired around the same time as the Republic. The moment blonde hair became fashionable, they declared civilization itself in danger. To them, bleached hair wasn't just vanity, it was rebellion. Rome, they claimed, was being corrupted by foreign ways, which was a bold statement from men wearing Greek sandals, quoting Greek philosophers, and drinking Egyptian wine while shouting about purity. Poet Juvenal, eternal patron saint of the grumpy, accused blonde women of being deceitful, lustful, and morally bankrupt, which in Roman society meant they were interesting. He ranted that women spent more time in front of mirrors than in temples, a shocking discovery that somehow still applies to influencers 2 millennia later. Then came the politicians. Moral laws were passed to restore traditional Roman virtue. Women were urged to stay modest, avoid luxury, and definitely not wear the hair of dead Germans on their heads, which naturally made everyone want to do it more. Every decree from the Senate was followed by a spike in wig sales. Nothing sells like disapproval. The panic spread through the streets. Husbands blamed blonde dye for marital ruin. Priests warned that golden hair invited the envy of Venus. And conservative writers claimed that Rome's downfall would come not from barbarians at the gates, but from blondes in the bedroom. It's unclear whether they feared divine punishment or just their wives having more fun. But here's the thing. Rome had been stealing other people's culture since day one. their gods were Greek, their art was Etruscan, and their hairstyles were German. So when they screamed about foreign influence, what they really meant was, we hate not being first. The moral panic achieved exactly nothing, of course. Rome kept bleaching, dyeing, and importing wigs by the ton. The city that claimed to hate excess was addicted to it, powdered, perfumed, and perfectly hypocritical. By the end of the century, the panic had burned out, and the blondes were still glowing. Because in Rome, nothing lasted forever, except fashion trends and irony. By the early empire, hair had become more than fashion. It was politics. Rome had laws for everything: what you could wear, who you could marry, how much jewellery you could flash, and, if the Senate could have figured out how to regulate it, probably how blonde you could be. In public, politicians preached restraint, the noble Roman ideal of modesty, discipline, and gravitas. In private, their wives were ordering imported German wigs by the crate. Every blonde in the forum was a silent political statement. Pale gold meant wealth. Copper meant ambition. Too dark, conservative, too bright, scandal. It was democracy for hair dye, dictatorship for everything else. The elite weaponized beauty like legislation. Empresses and noblewomen competed for dominance not through debate, but through shades of gold. Whoever glowed brightest in torchlight won the social hierarchy that week. Some even changed tones strategically, darker for mourning, lighter for seduction, somewhere in between for when gossip was circulating. It was less about romance and more about optics, which, ironically, describes Roman politics perfectly. Even men joined in the game. Senators mocked women for vanity while secretly hiring barbers to refresh their curls before major speeches. The same men who lectured about virtue spent hours plucking grey hairs with tweezers made of silver. A few even tinted their own hair blonde, insisting it was for the gods. Sure, Janus. But nothing divided Rome quite like the blonde question. To the moralists, it was the death of tradition, a symbol of foreign corruption. To the aristocrats, it was elegance itself, proof that even barbarian beauty could be conquered and domesticated. To the average citizen, it was just another thing rich people ruined. Hair colour became shorthand for class, virtue, and vice. Dark meant dutiful, blonde meant dangerous. But danger, as Rome knew too well, was addictive. By the 1st century, you could walk through the city and read its entire social structure just by looking at people's heads. Every curl, wig, and powdered strand told a story of ambition, lust, or pure survival. In the empire that ruled the world, the real battlefield wasn't fought with swords. It was fought in front of the mirror. If Rome had a national symbol, it wouldn't be the eagle. It would be a blonde wig. By the height of the empire, hair had become an export, an industry, and occasionally a war crime. The trade in wigs was so massive that entire supply chains existed just to keep Roman vanity satisfied. Blonde hair came mostly from Germania, where donations were rarely voluntary. Captives were shorn like sheep, their hair sold to merchants who washed it, perfumed it, and shipped it to Rome in bundles. It was the first recorded instance of imperial capitalism powered by other people's follicles. A really fine wig could cost more than a small farm, which, incidentally, was often how it was paid for. Aristocrats flaunted their authenticity with hair that once screamed in another language. Owning one wasn't about beauty, it was about ownership. Rome didn't just conquer people, it wore them. The upper classes competed for the softest texture and the lightest shade. One senator's wife supposedly had her slaves polish her wig daily with olive oil and wine because barbarian hair should learn Roman refinement. That's not metaphor. That's an actual quote from a woman who would have made a terrifying lifestyle influencer. Wigs weren't limited to women. Actors wore them on stage. Gladiators used them in comedic performances. Some men even had wigs dyed darker to disguise bald spots. A bald senator buying a wig made from a barbarian woman's head. That's not just fashion, that's performance art. Inevitably, Rome tried to regulate it. Edicts were passed forbidding excessive luxury, which in translation meant, "You're spending more on your head than my entire army's budget." Naturally, nobody listened. When it came to wigs, even Stoics had weak spots. By the 2nd century, there were entire neighbourhoods in Rome devoted to hair, stylists, wig makers, dye sellers, and merchants who could match your scalp tone to your political ambitions. The city buzzed with gossip, perfume and ambition disguised as blonde curls. Rome might have ruled the world with its legions, but it conquered fashion with scissors. Each wig was a silent victory, a portable monument to empire, vanity, and the eternal Roman art of turning someone else's suffering into style. Every empire eventually fades, and in Rome, even hair trends had a fall of their own. By the 3rd century, the blonde obsession that had burned through bathhouses and boudoirs finally began to lose its shine. The golden curls that once symbolized seduction and superiority started to feel, well, passé. Part of it was practical. The Roman economy was in ruins, the frontiers were collapsing, and importing authentic German hair became complicated when the Germans were busy storming your borders. It's hard to maintain your highlights when your empire's on fire. Fashion, like power, follows whoever's winning. As trade shifted eastward, so did taste. Suddenly, the Roman elite found themselves fascinated by darker, exotic beauty from Syria, Egypt, and Persia. Olive skin, heavy perfumes, and black curls became the new standard. A subtle message, perhaps. We've looted enough blondes. Let's diversify. Of course, some diehards refused to move on. You could still spot the occasional senator's wife clinging to her blonde wig like it was the last torch of civilization, the ancient equivalent of wearing last season's Gucci to a funeral. Poets mocked them mercilessly. "She still bleaches," wrote one, as if Rome were not already pale enough. Brutal. The wig markets dried up. The chemical recipes for bleaching were still known but fell out of favour. After centuries of sulphur, goat fat, and moral panic, the city's air finally smelled a little less like burnt vinegar and more like despair. But the end of the Blonde Age wasn't just about changing taste. It reflected a deeper shift. Rome was no longer the confident conqueror showing off its trophies. It was a tired empire, brittle, uncertain, and turning inward. Vanity requires stability, and the 3rd century had neither. By the time of Emperor Diocletian, even the laws against luxury felt pointless. There wasn't enough luxury left to ban. Rome's blonde dream had turned grey, literally and figuratively. Still, the memory lingered. Statues, frescoes, and poetry preserved the myth of golden-haired divinity. And though the dye pots were empty, the idea that power and beauty were the same colour never really died. It just went dark for a while, waiting for the Renaissance to rediscover the bleach. Rome may have fallen, but its vanity survived like a well-preserved wig in a sealed tomb. Empires crumble, languages die, religions evolve, but the myth of the blonde goddess, that one had eternal life. When Europe finally dragged itself out of the Dark Ages, someone dusted off a few Roman frescoes and said, "Ah yes, this. Let's do this again." Renaissance artists, ever faithful to old ideas disguised as innovation, resurrected the Roman blonde ideal. Venus reappeared on canvas, glowing in pale gold, lounging on seashells, and looking suspiciously well-conditioned for a woman born from sea foam. Botticelli's Birth of Venus could have just as easily been titled The Return of the Roman Beauty Standard. The Church, which once condemned vanity, quietly changed its tune. Saints, angels, and Madonnas began showing up with shimmering blonde hair. The divine had gone platinum. God, it seemed, had excellent taste. In medieval manuscripts, Eve, humanity's first sinner, was usually dark-haired, while Mary, humanity's redemption, often glowed blonde. Subtle, right? But it wasn't just religion. Across Europe, golden hair became shorthand for purity, grace, and moral superiority. the same traits Romans had once associated with their Germanic captives. History doesn't just repeat, it rebrands. The Roman beauty myth had migrated north, slipping quietly into the bloodstream of Western art and identity. Meanwhile, artists and poets kept feeding the fantasy. Blonde women symbolized divinity, love, and unattainable perfection, while brunettes got the role of mysterious temptress, or probably a witch. It was the same hierarchy Rome had invented, just painted with better lighting. Ironically, few of these Renaissance blondes were natural. Just like their Roman predecessors, noble women bleached their hair with sulfur, ash, and sunshine, baking their scalps under the Tuscan sun in the name of holiness. The methods hadn't improved, only the marketing had. The Romans might have been gone for 1,000 years, but their influence still sparkled in every gilded portrait and perfumed salon. They'd managed the impossible. They'd colonized beauty itself. Because while Rome's empire crumbled into dust, its idea of what divine looked like kept shining, eternal, golden, and just a little bit fake. In the end, Rome's love affair with blondes wasn't really about hair. It was about power, the kind that shines on the surface while something darker stirs underneath. Every curl, every wig, every cauldron of sulphur bubbling in a courtyard was an act of imitation, envy, and empire. The Romans didn't just want to look beautiful. They wanted to own beauty. And when they couldn't create it naturally, they imported it, conquered it, and wore it on their heads like a victory crown. Blonde hair became a symbol of Rome's favourite pastime, turning what was foreign into what was Roman. The same hands that built roads and aqueducts were busy stirring bleach and goat fat, desperate to copy the very people they called barbarian. It was never just vanity. It was identity theft on a civilizational scale. The empire didn't merely expand across geography, it expanded across aesthetics. To look Roman was to embody dominance, and to embody dominance was to look however Rome decided power should look this week. In a way, the blonde craze revealed everything about the empire, its insecurity, its appetite, and its genius for hypocrisy. Rome claimed moral virtue while chasing luxury, mocked the conquered while stealing their style, and built monuments to discipline while throwing orgies about eyeliner. It was a society terrified of decline and obsessed with youth, purity, and spectacle. Sound familiar? Even today, that same illusion persists. The Roman ideal, fair, flawless, glowing, still lingers in art, fashion, and film. We may have traded sulphur and vinegar for salon dye and filters, but the dream remains the same, to borrow beauty from somewhere else and call it our own. So did the ancient Romans love blondes? Absolutely. They loved them the way empires love everything, greedily, temporarily, and without self-awareness. For a time, blonde hair meant power, perfection, and divine favour. Then it meant decay, corruption, and excess. But through all of it, the message stayed the same. Beauty was never just about attraction, it was about control. And as Rome proved, sometimes the brightest shine belongs to a civilization right before it burns. Imagine standing on a windswept hill in ancient Britain. The air is thick with the smell of damp earth and smoke from distant hearths. A war horn echoes across the valley, and out from the mist, the Celts appear. Their hair glistens with lime, spiked and wild like the mane of some untamed beast. Their bodies, bare, fierce, and glimmering, are covered in swirling blue patterns that seem almost alive under the pale northern sun. These are the Picti, as the Romans called them, the painted people. To outsiders, the blue dye was barbaric, a savage attempt at intimidation. But to the Celts, it was something far deeper, an act of faith, beauty, and defiance. The pigment came from Isatis tinctoria, better known as woad, a hardy plant crushed, fermented, and turned into a rich indigo paste. Applied to the skin, it was said to harden the spirit and call upon the gods. Some believed the designs granted protection in battle, while others said they were talismans of identity. living sigils carved not into stone, but into flesh. Every swirl, every line carried meaning. Some spiraled like galaxies, symbolizing eternal rebirth. Others formed knots and animal shapes. Wolves, boars, ravens, sacred emblems of strength and cunning. Warriors painted themselves before combat not out of vanity, but as a ritual of transformation. Once the blue touched their skin, they ceased to be mortal farmers or hunters. They became instruments of the gods, embodiments of ancestral fury. The effect on enemies was devastating. Roman soldiers wrote with awe and disgust of these naked warriors, their cries echoing through fog and blood, their skin shimmering like living sapphire. To fight a Celt was to face not a man, but a spirit, a wild, divine creature who had merged with the very earth and sky. But beyond war, these markings carried pride. For the Celts, the body was a canvas upon which life itself was painted, each scar and swirl a testament to survival and selfhood. In a world of tribes and invaders, the blue tattoos whispered a single truth. We are still here, and we will not fade. Before the Celts ever touched a sword or painted their bodies blue, they wrapped themselves in colour. Across the misty hills of Gaul, Ireland and Britannia, tribesmen and women wore fabrics so vivid that Roman writers described them with envy and confusion. These were not drab tunics or simple hides. Celtic clothing was an explosion of pattern, plaids, stripes, and checks woven from dyed wool, each hue representing clan, rank, or spirit. To the Celts, fashion was not vanity. It was identity made visible. Wool was their canvas, and nature their palette. They used plants, roots, and minerals to create deep reds from madder, greens from moss, purples from heather, and yellows from saffron. The brightness of a cloak was a mark of pride. To appear dull was a kind of spiritual laziness. A chieftain's mantle might shimmer with golden threads, fastened at the shoulder with a gleaming bronze brooch, while warriors wore cloaks lined with fur for both warmth and intimidation. Even common folk took care to present themselves as part of the world's living tapestry. Their garments flowed, loose, layered, and designed for movement. Tunics reached the knees for men and to the ankles for women. Cloaks were clasped not only for protection, but for drama. A swirl of colour in the wind could announce one's status long before one's voice could. Every pattern told a story of family, tribe, or the gods they served. The famous Celtic brat, a rectangular wool cloak, was as essential to their identity as the sword or the harp. Foreigners saw wildness, the Celts saw harmony. Each knot and stripe echoed the twisting vines of their art, the spirals carved into stones, the endless cycle of life they worshipped. To them, beauty was divine order, and dressing boldly was a form of worship. Their clothes, like their tattoos, blurred the line between the sacred and the everyday, and when they painted their skin with woad, the patterns often mirrored their woven designs, as if their bodies themselves had become part of the same living fabric. In Celtic culture, to be clothed or painted was to be known, to carry your world on your skin. If fabric spoke of tribe and colour marked the spirit, then metal was the Celts' language of pride. Jewellery wasn't mere decoration. It was status, protection, and faith forged in fire. Archaeologists still unearth torques, bracelets, and brooches from burial mounds, their curves elegant, their designs intricate enough to rival any Greek artisan. Yet these gleaming ornaments were distinctly Celtic, bold, organic, and alive with motion. The torque was the most sacred of all. A thick, open-ended neck ring made of twisted bronze, silver, or gold. It was worn by chieftains, warriors, and sometimes even gods in sculpture. To wear one was to declare yourself part of a divine lineage, a being closer to the other world. The weight around the neck wasn't just physical, it was symbolic of duty and power. Some torques were so large they seemed ceremonial, too heavy for daily wear, suggesting they were donned only during sacred gatherings or before battle. Celtic craftsmanship was fearless. Using lost wax casting and fine hammering, smiths created pieces that danced with life, spirals, serpents, animals intertwined in endless loops. These patterns mirrored their belief in the eternal cycle, life, death, rebirth, and reflected the same energy that ran through their tattoos and textiles. The same spiral that a druid might paint in woad upon the skin was repeated in bronze on the body. Even the poorest Celt might wear a small pin or ring. Brooches held cloaks in place, but were often miniature masterpieces, engraved with knotwork and inlaid with enamel. The elite took this further, adorning themselves with mirrors, anklets, and earrings, their reflections flickering in torchlight during feasts and rituals. Metal became a mirror of identity, shining with both craftsmanship and myth. Romans mocked these adornments as barbaric excess, yet many later adopted Celtic designs for their own jewellery. The truth was undeniable. Celtic metalwork wasn't primitive, it was visionary. Each piece carried the pulse of a people who believed beauty had power, that art could guard the soul. When the Celts entered battle, cloaked in plaid, skin painted blue, torques gleaming under the grey sky, they didn't just fight for land. They fought as walking works of art, each warrior a masterpiece of defiance and devotion. To the Celts, Woad was more than a die. It was a living symbol of transformation. Preparing it was a sacred craft that bordered on alchemy. Women gathered the tall green plants in summer, crushing their leaves into pulp, then fermenting the mixture until it frothed with a pungent, earthy scent. The paste, once dried and reconstituted, turned a deep, almost luminous blue. This was not casual body art. Applying woad was a ceremony of courage and connection to the divine. Before battle, warriors would strip to the waist or sometimes go entirely naked, standing around a fire while druids chanted invocations to the gods. The blue paste was smeared onto the skin with care. Each swirl, knot and curve chosen according to one's tribe, ancestry and purpose. Some marks were protective, invoking deities like Tyrannus, god of thunder, or Morrigan, the phantom queen of battle. Others told personal stories, victories, oaths, or the memory of fallen kin. The process was part meditation, part transformation. The cold woad against warm skin seemed to awaken something primal within. As the fire crackled and the air filled with smoke and chanting, the line between man and spirit blurred. When dawn came, the painted warriors looked like creatures born from another world, blue as the sky, shining with sweat and destiny. Romans wrote of their horror and fascination. Julius Caesar described the Celts of Britain as terrible in aspect, their blue bodies glistening under the morning sun. But what he saw as savagery was, in truth, a ritual of empowerment. Woad didn't just decorate, it consecrated. It reminded every Celt that their body was not separate from their land or gods. To paint oneself in blue was to claim unity with the earth and sky, to step into battle not merely as a soldier, but as a living offering. Even after the Romans came and the old rites faded, echoes of this ritual lingered, in Celtic knotwork, in the spirals carved into ancient stones, in the art that still carries the same rhythmic, flowing motion. The Celts may have disappeared into history, but their blue mark never faded. It still pulses beneath the skin of time. The Celts didn't just wear colour, they ruled through it. Every hue had a meaning, every thread a whisper of hierarchy and belief. In a land without written laws of fashion, colour was law enough. To wear certain shades was a privilege earned, not chosen. A chieftain's crimson cloak, for instance, was more than a sign of wealth. It proclaimed bloodline, valour, and divine favour. Red was the colour of life and battle, of both the wound and the victory. It was said that to wear too much of it without earning it was to invite the gods' wrath. Green, on the other hand, symbolised fertility and peace, the colour of Danu, the earth goddess. It wrapped poets, healers, and those connected to the mysteries of nature. Blue, once reserved for tattoos and sacred ritual, was worn by druids and seers who claimed insight into unseen realms. Gold, of course, was the hue of kings. But gold wasn't always metal. Sometimes it was wool dyed with rare saffron or adorned with tiny bronze beads that caught the light like sunlit dew. Their dyes came from the landscape itself, a partnership between art and environment. Bark, berries, lichen, and herbs were crushed into powders or boiled into brews that stained fabric with breathtaking permanence. A woman might dye her hair black with bog ash, or tint it red with crushed berries before a festival. Warriors rubbed themselves with bright grease or clay, amplifying their presence before battle. A human sunrise against grey mist. Even their animals reflected this love for colour. Horses were sometimes painted before ceremonies, their manes braided with ribbons, their coats brushed with blue or white chalk. In a world where the divine was everywhere, in rivers, stones, storms, colour became the Celts' way of speaking to it. To wear vibrant hues was to participate in creation itself, to echo the vividness of nature back to the gods who made it. When Roman envoys arrived, they mocked what they called Celtic flamboyance. Yet those same Romans, years later, would import Celtic dyes and fabrics into their markets. The Celts' wild colours outlived their tribes. They stained the imagination of Europe itself, long after the woad had faded from their skin. Among the Celts, women didn't just share men's customs, they shaped them. From queens to craftswomen, their presence defined the visual soul of Celtic society. In the open-air markets of Gaul or the green valleys of Ireland, women stood tall, wrapped in flowing linen dresses dyed in radiant shades of saffron, emerald, or wine red. Their cloaks, fastened with ornate brooches, billowed like banners of identity. Every fold of fabric and glint of metal spoke of power, lineage, and artistry. Celtic women were admired and feared by outsiders for their fierce independence. Unlike their Greek or Roman counterparts, they could own property, lead warriors, and even rule kingdoms. Their fashion reflected that autonomy. A noble woman might wear multiple rings on her arms, heavy torques on her neck, and elaborate plaits woven with gold thread or tiny bronze beads. Her reflection in a polished bronze mirror wasn't vanity, it was ritual. Beauty, to her, was a form of power, a declaration that she was both mortal and divine. Hair held special significance. Some women bleached it with lime until it shone like sunlight. Others let it flow wild and dark, symbolizing fertility and mystery. Hairstyles could mark marital status, tribal identity, or religious devotion. During sacred festivals, priestesses wove flowers or feathers into their hair, offerings to Brigid, goddess of inspiration and craft. Their appearance was an invocation, each braid a prayer made visible. Perfumes, too, were part of their art. The Celts mixed oils from herbs like thyme and rosemary with animal fat to create scented balms. These were rubbed into skin and hair not merely for fragrance, but for protection and healing, a harmony between body and spirit. Even jewellery carried hidden meaning. Spiral pendants for eternity, bird-shaped brooches for transcendence, crescent earrings for moonlight's favour. Roman chroniclers, half in awe and half in disbelief, wrote of Celtic women riding into battle beside their men, cloaks flying, spears raised, faces painted with blue. They were elegance wrapped in ferocity, the living embodiment of balance between beauty and strength. To be a Celtic woman was to be untamed and divine, a force that no empire, however vast, could fully comprehend or control. At dawn, when the mist clung low over the moors, the Celtic warbands prepared for battle, not by sharpening swords, but by painting their souls. Naked but for their torques and cloaks, warriors gathered around fires, chanting low hymns to the gods of war. Woad paste was passed from hand to hand, cool, thick, and pungent. They smeared it across their chests, faces, and limbs in spirals and sigils, marking themselves as living weapons. To a Roman legionary facing them, These warriors looked less like men and more like spirits conjured from the earth itself. The blue skin was not just for show, it was armour of belief. The Celts thought Woad could harden the flesh, making them impervious to pain. More importantly, it was psychological warfare. Imagine standing in formation, seeing an army of half-naked men charging through fog, their bodies glowing blue, their hair spiked with lime, screaming war cries in a language older than the Empire itself. The Romans wrote that their courage was unnatural. They laugh at death, one soldier recorded, as if it were a feast. Each mark of Woad carried purpose. Some warriors painted their faces with jagged lines meant to summon lightning. Others drew circles to symbolize the sun's eternal return. Before battle, druids would anoint them, blessing the paint with sacred ash or the smoke of burning oak. The transformation was total, a merging of human and divine. By the time they marched, each man had ceased to be merely himself. He was the embodiment of his ancestors, his tribe, his gods. The Celts also believed that dying painted in Woad ensured a noble afterlife. To fall in battle unmarked was shameful, a sign that one had not truly offered oneself to the divine struggle. In blue, they were both beautiful and terrifying, artists and warriors in equal measure. Even after defeat, their enemies could not forget them. Roman poets immortalized their azure warriors, their blue ghosts of the north. The Woad stains lingered even on the corpses, as if the paint refused to surrender to death. Through pigment and courage, Celtic warriors achieved what every man craves: immortality, not in body, but in memory and myth. Behind the Celts' vibrant appearance and symbolic tattoos stood a silent, guiding force: the Druids. They were not merely priests, but philosophers, healers, and keepers of cosmic order. To them, fashion, colour, and markings were not trivial aesthetics, but sacred geometry, the visible echo of the unseen world. The spirals, knots, and animal motifs that adorned Celtic bodies and clothes mirrored the Druids' teachings of balance and eternal return. Before any great event, a coronation, a harvest, or a battle, Druids would bless the dyes and pigments. They burned oak leaves and mistletoe, chanting in the old tongue while smoke drifted through the encampments. Blue woad and crimson madder became sanctified through ritual, believed to channel divine energy into whoever wore them. A warrior's tattoo might be designed by a druid's hand, each line calculated to align with lunar phases or ancestral totems. In this sense, art was magic, and the body was its altar. Druids viewed adornment as a dialogue with nature. They taught that gold captured the sun's spirit, silver embodied the moon, and bronze held the breath of the earth. When a Celt clasped a golden torque around their neck, they were not merely decorating themselves. They were wearing a piece of cosmic order, binding themselves to the rhythm of the universe. Even clothing dyes followed the same logic: green for rebirth, red for transformation, blue for wisdom. In festivals, Druids themselves wore robes dyed white with chalk or grey with ash, symbolizing purity and transcendence. Some accounts describe them weaving threads of mistletoe into their hair, or painting runes across their arms during sacred gatherings. To the uninitiated, it looked theatrical. To the Celts, it was the living expression of faith. Through their influence, every act of self-presentation became sacred. To dress, to tattoo, to braid hair, these were all prayers in motion. A Celtic warrior didn't go into battle merely to fight. He went to fulfill a spiritual duty. A woman didn't weave a cloak just to stay warm. She created a spell of protection and prosperity. The Druids blurred the boundary between the mundane and the mystical, and in doing so, they made the Celts' beauty divine. Though centuries have passed since the Celts painted themselves in blue and wrapped their bodies in vivid plaid, their aesthetic never truly vanished. It lingers like a ghost in modern fashion, art, and even national identity. The tartans of Scotland, the intricate knotwork of Ireland, the swirling tattoos of contemporary Celtic revivalists, all trace their lineage back to those wild tribes who wore their souls on their skin. What the Romans called barbarism has become a symbol of cultural pride and creative rebellion. The Woad, that sacred blue of the ancients, finds echoes today in indigo denim, navy uniforms, and symbolic body art. Modern tattoo artists still borrow the spiral and knot designs that once adorned warriors and priestesses, unknowingly repeating the same meditations on eternity that druids whispered about under sacred oaks. Each twist of line and curve of ink carries the same message. The cycle never ends. The body remains a canvas for meaning, just as it was 2,000 years ago. Celtic textiles also evolved, weaving their influence into the very fabric of Europe. The bold checks and plaids that once distinguished tribes later became emblems of clans, visual surnames in thread. Even now, tartans evoke loyalty and belonging, their colours tied to family and history. A simple scarf patterned in red and green can carry the same ancestral weight as a warrior's painted chest. The Celts had understood long before the modern world that style could be both armour and declaration. Archaeologists still unearth bronze torques, amber beads, and bits of dyed fabric from bog burials, artefacts that have defied decay, just as Celtic spirit defied conquest. Each discovery reminds us that their fashion was more than ornamentation. It was identity crystallized, a fusion of body, spirit, and earth. Today, Celtic art is global. From tattoos to jewellery to festival attire, people across the world adopt those ancient symbols, spirals of power, knots of continuity, colours of life and death, to express individuality and connection. The Celts might not have built empires, but they built something far more enduring, a visual language of freedom. Their legacy lives not in stone, but in skin, cloth, and the imagination of all who still dare to live boldly in colour. In the dawn-lit valleys of ancient Illyria, where rivers coiled through forests thick with juniper and pine, love was not a fleeting emotion. It was a force of nature, both feared and revered. The women of the Illyrian tribes knew that passion could heal or destroy, so they learned to harness it through charms, herbs, and whispered invocations. These weren't the trinkets of superstition, but sacred instruments of the heart, tokens infused with belief, intention, and the pulse of the earth itself. An Illyrian girl, upon reaching womanhood, would often receive her first love charm from her mother or grandmother, a carved seashell or polished bronze pendant strung on a strip of cured leather. Hidden within its hollow was a blend of herbs, juniper berries for desire, wormwood for protection, and crushed rosemary to seal fidelity. These amulets were worn close to the skin, under garments, warmed by the body's own heartbeat. The mixture of sweat, metal, and herb was believed to awaken the charm, to breathe life into the spell. Illyrians believed that every natural thing possessed spirit. A stone from a riverbed might hold patience, a feather from a dove, tenderness. To craft a love charm was to invite these spirits into harmony, to command them gently toward one's will. For a young woman hoping to capture a lover's eye, a pendant of polished bone shaped into a spiral could summon attraction. For a wife fearing her husband's wandering gaze, a knot of red thread wrapped around wormwood would guard against betrayal. But these charms were more than practical magic. They were language, silent poems written in symbol and scent. Each herb and carving carried a story older than memory. Juniper, the fire of the goddess Anzotica. Wormwood, the bitter herb of endurance. Salt, the purifier of the soul. Together they formed a secret lexicon of love known only to women. When dusk fell and the hearths glowed, Illyrian women would whisper to their pendants before sleep, confessions of longing, prayers for loyalty, or pleas for release. They believed the charms listened, that the bronze absorbed their desires and released them into the night. In Illyria, love wasn't spoken aloud. It was worn, hidden, and enchanted. The making of an Illyrian love charm was an art that blurred the line between craft and sorcery. No woman undertook it lightly. The process began with gathering, a ritual as sacred as the spell itself. At dawn, when dew still clung to the leaves, women ventured into the woods barefoot, their silence a form of reverence. They collected herbs known for their dual power, to arouse passion and repel deceit. Juniper for desire, wormwood for protection, thyme for courage, and wild mint for clarity. Each plant was spoken to before it was picked, thanked for its spirit, and wrapped in linen to preserve its potency. Back in their homes, the women worked beside the hearth, where smoke coiled like a living spirit. The herbs were dried, crushed, and mixed with salt or honey, the ingredients of preservation and sweetness. Bronze and bone were the favoured materials for the charm casings. Bronze was the metal of the sun, believed to attract warmth and life, while bone connected the wearer to ancestors, binding her to the lineage of women who had cast spells before her. Each charm was unique, shaped by intention. A pendant for attraction might bear an engraving of two intertwined serpents, a symbol of passion and unity, while a charm for protection featured a crescent moon, invoking the watchful goddess of night. The craftsman, often a woman skilled in metallurgy or carving, worked in silence, for words could confuse the spirits. Once assembled, the charm was consecrated. The woman would hold it above smoke from burning sage and juniper, while reciting an invocation, part plea, part promise. Let my love burn true, and his eyes see none but me, an ancient verse went. A few drops of oil or blood sealed the bond, awakening the amulet's power. To an outsider, this may have seemed superstition, but to the Illyrians, it was science of the soul. They believed that emotion had substance, that love could be stored, carried, and released through physical form. Each charm was a vessel of longing, each pendant a promise made to unseen forces. When worn against the skin, the boundary between the woman and the spell dissolved, and her desire became fate. The Illyrians believed that every herb held a secret, a living pulse of the gods. To mix them was to compose a kind of poetry, written not with ink but with scent and essence. Juniper berries, wormwood, and rosemary were the triad most often used in charms of love and fidelity. Juniper, the fiery seed of the highlands, was said to awaken the blood and stir longing. Wormwood, bitter and sharp, was its opposite, a shield against deceit and unworthy lovers. Together they formed balance, passion and prudence, desire and defence. A woman seeking love might begin with juniper. She would crush the berries beneath her fingertips, releasing their resin into oil or honey, whispering the name of the man she longed for. The charm, once sealed, was worn close to the heart, its aroma faint but constant, a heartbeat in scent form. Over time, the wearer would believe her own confidence grew stronger, her presence more magnetic. To the Illyrians, this wasn't illusion, but the spell taking root, love energy made visible through self-assurance. Wormwood, meanwhile, was for the betrayed or the cautious. Its bitterness embodied endurance. Women burned it beside their beds to drive away jealousy, lies, and wandering hearts. A bronze pendant filled with wormwood leaves was believed to make a lover faithful, not through coercion, but through a subtle weaving of loyalty into his spirit. To enhance its strength, some mixed it with ashes from burned letters or locks of hair, blending memory with magic. Other plants joined these rituals in more secretive ways. Wild thyme, associated with courage, was often tucked into the hem of a tunic before a woman confessed her feelings. Rosemary was woven into braids during weddings to ensure harmony, while myrtle, sacred to love itself, was placed beneath pillows to summon dreams of one's destined partner. Each herb was alive, and each combination told a story. In Illyrian lore, herbs did not simply symbolize emotion, they embodied it. To wear them was to carry living witnesses of the heart's desire, and as long as their fragrance lingered, the bond between the human and the divine remained unbroken, a love that could be felt, smelled, and remembered. While herbs carried the scent of love, bronze and bone gave it shape. To the Illyrians, these materials weren't chosen for beauty alone. They were vessels of spiritual energy, each holding its own resonance. Bronze was the breath of the sun, a living metal forged in fire and symbolizing vitality, courage, and eternal passion. Bone, on the other hand, came from the earth's creatures, a reminder of mortality, ancestry, and the thin line between life and death. Together, they formed the body and soul of every Illyrian charm. Bronze pendants were most common among noble women and priestesses. The metal was polished until it shone like amber, reflecting both the sun and the wearer's inner light. Before it was cast, the bronze was often mixed with a few grains of salt or ash from sacred fires, binding it to the divine. Artisans engraved these pendants with spirals, circles, and crescent moons, symbols of love's endless cycle. Some were shaped like shells or hearts, others like the wings of doves or the horns of stags, each form whispering a different kind of desire. Bone charms carried deeper, more secret meanings. They were intimate, often carved from the remains of hunted animals or ancestral relics. A charm made from a bird's bone promised freedom and passion. One from a deer carried the energy of pursuit and grace. For women who had lost lovers to war or betrayal, bone amulets were talismans of remembrance. Fragments of the living turned sacred through touch and devotion. The process of crafting these charms was steeped in ritual. Women worked in quiet rooms lit only by hearth fire, shaping bronze with small hammers and carving bone with sharpened flint. The silence was deliberate. Sound was said to disturb the spirit within the material. Once complete, the charm was dipped in herbal oil and held over smoke from burning juniper, sealing its power. When the bronze glowed warm against the skin or the bone charm rested cool near the heart, the wearer felt connected to something larger, the eternal rhythm of love, loss, and longing. The Illyrians believed that as long as metal and bone endured, so too would the desires they carried. In Illyrian love magic, meaning was not written in words but in form. Every curve, line, and pattern carved into an amulet spoke its own dialect of desire. The women who crafted these charms knew that the gods listened not to speech, but to symbols, and so they learned to write their feelings in bronze and bone, using a language older than the alphabet. The spiral was the most ancient and powerful of all. It symbolized the journey of the heart, from longing to fulfillment, from passion to peace, then back again. To carve a spiral was to acknowledge that love never stood still. It turned endlessly, like the seasons. Lovers exchanged spiral pendants as promises of constancy, believing that as long as the design endured, their hearts would return to each other across any distance. The knot was another sacred motif, a visual prayer for unity. Some were simple loops of leather cord, others were intricate braids of silver wire. The tighter the knot, the stronger the bond it represented. Married couples often tied their charms together before the wedding ceremony, merging their destinies through craft rather than contract. If the knot unravelled with time, it was seen as a warning, a sign that betrayal or misfortune lurked near. Animals, too, spoke through these designs. Doves embodied tenderness, snakes symbolized seduction, and stags represented pursuit and loyalty. When a woman carved a snake onto her amulet, she wasn't invoking deceit, she was calling upon transformation, the ability to shed old love and emerge renewed. A charm shaped like a bird promised liberation from jealousy or grief, its wings a reminder that love must breathe to live. Even geometric shapes had power. The circle invoked wholeness. The crescent moon called to the goddess of fertility and desire. Triangles pointing upward were symbols of masculine fire. Downward, they represented the feminine, water, intuition, and birth. When the two were fused, they formed a diamond, harmony between passion and peace. To the Illyrians, these carvings weren't decoration. They were coded messages to the gods and the heart alike, silent invocations woven into beauty. A charm's power wasn't in its metal or herb, but in its meaning, the sacred geometry of love, etched forever into time. When love was desired or threatened, Illyrian women turned to the ritual of binding, a ceremony that joined two souls through charm and intention. It was not a public rite, but a secret, moonlit act, performed in the stillness of night when the world's noise fell away. Some bindings were born from tenderness, others from desperation, but all were woven with care, for to bind love was to touch fate itself. The ritual began with preparation. The woman would cleanse herself in river water infused with crushed herbs, juniper for desire, rosemary for devotion, and wormwood to guard against deceit. Her skin was anointed with oil, her hair unbraided to symbolize openness. She wore no jewelry, save for the pendant she would enchant. At her side burned a clay lamp, its flame flickering in rhythm with her heartbeat. The charm itself, often a bronze shell or coiled spiral, was placed upon a cloth of red wool, the colour of blood and union. The woman whispered her lover's name into the hollow of the charm 3 times, her breath believed to awaken its spirit. Then came the binding verse, spoken in Illyrian tongue, a blend of prayer and command. Let our hearts beat in one rhythm, our eyes see one dawn, our fates be twined till the stars forget their path. A red thread was wound around the charm as the words were spoken, each knot a promise, each turn a vow. Some women wove strands of their hair into the thread, believing it tied their essence to their lovers. Others pricked their fingers, letting a drop of blood seal the final knot. When the ritual was done, the charm was hidden under the pillow for 7 nights before being worn, close to the heart. Yet, this magic had its dangers. To bind love was to deny the gods their freedom to weave fate. If done out of greed or jealousy, the charm could backfire, turning passion into obsession, or affection into sorrow. The Illyrians understood this balance well. True love charms did not enslave, they harmonized. The ritual's power lay not in control, but in connection, a merging of hearts under the silent witness of the moon. In Illyrian culture, love was sacred, but loyalty was divine. Fidelity charms were among the most carefully crafted of all, designed not to inflame desire, but to preserve trust once it had been earned. For the Illyrians, betrayal wasn't merely emotional, it was spiritual contamination, a disturbance of the balance between souls. To protect against it, women created amulets imbued with devotion, faith, and vigilance, invisible guardians of the heart. The most common form was the bronze pendant of binding, a small disc engraved with 2 entwined lines that never crossed nor broke, a symbol of unity without dominance. Within its hollow core rested a mixture of dried wormwood, crushed rose petals, and powdered shell. Wormwood guarded against deceit, rose petals rekindled tenderness, and shell invoked the sea goddess Thana, protector of vows. Worn close to the skin, the amulet was believed to hum softly with the rhythm of the wearer's heartbeat, reminding both giver and receiver of their promise. Men carried their own versions too. Warriors departing for battle were given leather cords strung with polished river stones, or fragments of their beloved's jewellery. Some even carried a small pouch containing a lock of hair mixed with salt, a charm meant to keep the mind clear and the spirit faithful while far from home. If temptation arose, they were told to grip the amulet and speak a short invocation. Eyes to the horizon, heart to the one who waits. Not all charms guarded romantic fidelity. Some were meant to preserve friendship or family loyalty. Mothers tied blue threads around their children's wrists before long journeys, whispering blessings for honesty and remembrance. Sisters exchanged tiny bone pendants carved with twin moons, promising eternal trust even when separated by distance or marriage. The true magic, however, lay not in the materials, but in the intention. Illyrians believed that faithfulness, once pledged, summoned its own spirit, a watchful guardian that lingered near the lovers. Should one heart waver, the other would feel it. A tightening in the chest, a restless dream, a faint shiver in the night. These sensations were seen not as punishment, but as warnings, chances to restore harmony before the bond broke. Not all Illyrian love charms were innocent. Hidden within the same culture that honoured fidelity and tenderness existed another, darker craft, one whispered about in market stalls and mountain shrines. These were the forbidden charms, tools of seduction, manipulation, and vengeance. Where ordinary amulets sought harmony, these sought control. And though they were feared, they were never forgotten, for love's shadow side was as powerful as its light. Such charms were said to be crafted under a waning moon, a time when energies faded and boundaries thinned. The woman who dared to make one often did so alone, barefoot and silent, her face veiled to conceal her intent from the spirits. She would mix burnt wormwood with ash from a lover's discarded garment, a fragment of bone, and a drop of her own blood. This blend, sealed in a small bronze locket or wrapped in animal hide, was meant to awaken irresistible desire, or, in darker hearts, unending guilt. The most feared of all was the charm of turning, used when love curdled into betrayal. Women scorned by faithless partners fashioned these amulets to turn the heart cold. The ritual called for the charm to be buried where 3 rivers met, symbolizing the crossroads of fate. Once done, it was believed that the betrayer's affections would sour, their passions fading into confusion and regret. Such practices were not sanctioned by druids or priestesses. They were acts of rebellion, driven by wounded pride or forbidden longing. Yet even these charms carried wisdom. They revealed the Illyrians' understanding that love could not exist without danger. Passion, left unchecked, could burn as easily as it could warm. Legends tell of women who used forbidden charms only to regret it, their lovers returning, but hollow, emotionless, bound by something unnatural. Others claimed success, that kings fell hopelessly enamored of priestesses, that chieftains abandoned war for love spells whispered in secret. In truth, the forbidden charms reflected a deeper truth about Illyrian belief, that every emotion, even love, demanded balance. For every blessing, there was a curse. For every union, a risk. The Illyrians understood what few societies ever have, that love's greatest power lay not in purity, but in its dangerous, untamable depth. Though the Illyrian tribes faded into the shadows of history, their charms and amulets left behind echoes that never truly vanished. Archaeologists have unearthed small bronze pendants, seashells pierced for stringing, and bone carvings shaped like moons and spirals, silent remnants of a people who believed love was a living spirit. Even after their kingdoms fell to Rome and their gods were renamed, the Illyrian language of affection endured, hidden in rural customs, wedding rituals, and whispered blessings passed from mother to daughter. In the mountain villages of the Western Balkans, traces of these beliefs survived for centuries. Women still tied red threads around their wrists to ward off envy, placed juniper beneath pillows to invite dreams of true love, and burned wormwood to cleanse a faithless heart. These were not mere superstitions. They were fragments of an ancient worldview in which emotion, nature, and divinity were inseparable. To love was to perform a sacred act. To craft a charm was to shape fate with one's own hands. Modern scholars once dismissed these amulets as trinkets, the playthings of a primitive people. But recent discoveries have revealed their sophistication, how precise the engravings were, how intentional the herbal blends, how harmoniously they combined artistry and spirituality. The Illyrians understood something we often forget, that belief gives objects power, and intention turns matter into magic. Even today, echoes of Illyrian passion can be felt in Mediterranean love traditions, from the rosemary wreaths of Dalmatia to the protective pendants worn by brides across Albania and Montenegro. The symbolism of the spiral, the knot, and the crescent still reappears in jewellery, tattoos, and folk art, carrying forward the same messages of unity, desire, and eternal return. If you look closely, you can still see them. The bronze gleam of a pendant in a marketplace, the scent of juniper in a festival fire, the faint trace of wormwood in a healing tea. These are the descendants of Illyrian charms, quietly reminding the modern world that love, at its core, is both fragile and immortal. The Illyrians may be gone, but their magic endures, not as myth, but as the lingering heartbeat of a civilization that once dared to bind the divine to desire. In the misty dawns of ancient Illyria, Where rivers cut through emerald valleys and springs shimmered like veins of light, there rose sanctuaries dedicated to Bindus, the god of flowing waters. To the Illyrians, Bindus was not merely a deity, he was life itself. Every drop that nourished their crops, healed their wounds, or blessed their births was said to pass through his domain. His temples stood not atop mountains or within cities, but beside streams and springs, where the world breathed with him. Women were the first to approach his altars each morning. They came barefoot, their feet damp with dew, carrying earthen bowls filled with milk, honey, and polished river shells. These offerings glistened in the rising light before being poured into the waters, a sacred merging of sweetness and purity. They believed that honey softened Bindus's temper, milk strengthened his favour, and shells, born from the meeting of land and sea, reflected his dual nature, gentleness and power. The temples themselves were not grand palaces of stone, but open sanctuaries carved by nature's hand. A circular altar often stood beside a flowing source, a spring that never dried, even in drought. Water trickled constantly through the shrine, catching sunlight and casting ripples across bronze idols, shaped in the likeness of the god. Half man, half wave. Priests and priestesses tended these places, keeping the air rich with the scent of burning sage and crushed myrtle. Bindus was protector, lover, and judge. Expectant mothers sought his blessing for safe childbirth, dipping their hands into sacred basins and whispering prayers for strength. Young brides brought him gifts to ensure passion and harmony in marriage, believing that the god's waters could cleanse jealousy and grant fertility. Even warriors prayed before campaign, asking Bindus to wash away fear and grant swift victory. Each ritual ended the same way, with silence. The women knelt, listening to the water's murmur, waiting for a sign, a sudden ripple, a rising mist, a bird's call. These were Bindus's replies, subtle but never ignored. For in Illyria, the water did not simply flow, it spoke. And to those who listened, it carried the voice of the god who dwelled within every living current. Long before the first shrine was built, Illyrian spoke of Bindus as a presence that predated mankind itself, a god born not from sky or stone, but from the eternal movement of water. His name carried whispers of rushing streams and the sigh of rain over fields. To them, Bindus was not an absent deity high above the clouds, but a spirit who dwelled among them, in every ripple, every drop, every spring that never ceased to flow. Legends say Bindus emerged when the earth first wept. The mountains, mourning their barrenness, shed tears that pooled into rivers. From these tears the god arose, shimmering, translucent, crowned with foam. His voice was the murmur of brooks, his temper the violence of storms. He could heal or destroy, bless a mother's womb or drown a careless sailor. Illyrian myth painted him as both lover and avenger, the heart of nature's duality, soft as rain, merciless as flood. His dominion was vast. He ruled not only rivers, but also the springs that bubbled beneath the earth, which the Illyrians saw as entrances to the divine. To bathe in them was to be reborn. To drink from them was to commune with him. Women believed that during childbirth, Bindus's essence flowed through their veins, guiding life safely into the world. Hunters prayed to his streams for luck, farmers to his rains for growth, and lovers to his reflection for clarity of heart. The earliest temples were simple altars, circles of stone beside sacred water. But with time, devotion deepened. Bronze figurines depicting Bindus with flowing hair and hands outstretched were set at river mouths and springs, their surfaces polished by centuries of touch. Each offering, honey, milk or shell, represented the human desire to mirror the god's purity and generosity. Even the Romans, when they came, found it impossible to suppress him. They equated Bindus with their own Neptune, yet his Illyrian essence endured, wilder, older, closer to the human heart. For the Illyrians knew, to worship Bindus was to understand life's rhythm, that love, birth, and death were but waves of the same eternal current. all returning to the god who flowed through them. Across Illyria's rolling landscapes, the Temples of Bindus were unlike any others in the ancient world. They did not reach toward the heavens, they opened themselves to the earth. Built beside natural springs, waterfalls, and rivers that never froze, these shrines embodied the belief that divinity flowed within the land itself. The Illyrians saw no boundary between nature and the sacred. Water was both altar and god. Each temple followed the same design, a circular space open to the sky, with no walls to separate the worshippers from the elements. At its centre stood a stone basin, continually replenished by an underground spring. This basin was the heart of the sanctuary, where offerings were placed and prayers whispered. Around it, carved pillars bore images of waves, serpents, and women carrying jars, symbols of life, fertility, and transformation. The sound of water echoed constantly, creating an unending chant that replaced the need for words. The priests and priestesses of Bindus were keepers of the flow. They tended the springs, ensuring the channels remained clean and pure. Every drop mattered, for to allow the water to stagnate was an insult to the god. Women came to these temples not only to pray for fertility or protection in childbirth, but also to cleanse themselves of grief or betrayal. The act of bathing in the sacred water was believed to strip away sorrow and restore balance between body and spirit. At certain times of the year, especially in spring and autumn, festivals filled these shrines with music and light. Villagers carried torches and bowls of honey, pouring them into the water as songs rose in rhythmic waves. The air filled with the scent of burning herbs, milk, and beeswax. Young couples sought blessings for passion, mothers prayed for safety, and travellers offered polished stones for safe return. To the Illyrians, these temples were living things, breathing with the rhythm of the earth, pulsing with divine current. Even long after Bindus's name faded from worship, his sanctuaries remained alive in legend. Locals whispered that the springs still listened, that the water still shimmered when a prayer was spoken. And perhaps, in those rippling depths, the god of the rivers still stirred. The worship of Bindus was deeply entwined with the lives of Illyrian women. It was they who carried the offerings, tended the shrines, and whispered the prayers that kept the god's favour flowing through their homes and bodies. Water, to them, was not just a source of life. It was a mirror of womanhood itself, fluid, nurturing, yet capable of fierce and unstoppable force. From girlhood, Illyrian women were taught to honour Bindus. On the morning of their first moon cycle, mothers would bring their daughters to the nearest spring. There, the girl would wash her hands and forehead, and the priestess would pour honey and milk into the stream, saying, "As this river flows, so shall your life, sweet, strong, and unbroken." It was the beginning of a lifelong bond with the god who governed both fertility and renewal. Married women visited Bindus's temples for blessings in love and childbirth. They wore simple linen robes and carried shells or small bronze cups filled with milk, symbols of nourishment and devotion. Kneeling by the water, they would touch the surface 3 times, once for passion, once for fertility, once for safe delivery. The ripples that spread outward were believed to carry their prayers into the unseen world. During pregnancy, women returned often to the springs. They believed that Bindus's waters flowed also through their bodies, connecting them to the rhythm of creation itself. In the final month before birth, they performed a sacred washing ritual, guided by the priestesses, who anointed their bellies with juniper oil and murmured ancient hymns. Some brought their newborns to the same temple days later, to bathe them for the first time in the god's blessing. But water was also a place of solace. Widows and betrayed lovers came to the rivers of Bindus to cleanse themselves of grief. They left behind tokens, locks of hair, broken rings, fragments of old charms, casting them into the current as if surrendering their pain to the god's mercy. Through all stages of life, women were the guardians of Bindus's faith. They tended his waters as they tended life itself, understanding that what they gave, love, prayer, or tears, would one day return to them in the eternal flow of his divine river. At the heart of Bindus's worship lay the simplest of acts, the giving of gifts. Every offering poured into his waters carried meaning. Every gesture bound mortal and divine together through trust and reverence. The Illyrians believed that Bindus, though mighty, was gentle to those who honoured him sincerely. His favour could be courted not with gold or blood, but with sweetness and purity. Honey and milk, the twin essences of life itself. Honey was the first offering at dawn. Women would carry it in clay bowls or hollowed shells, their steps slow and deliberate. The golden liquid caught the sunlight as they poured it into the spring, where it swirled like captured sunlight beneath the rippling surface. Honey was more than sweetness. It was a symbol of continuity. It never spoiled, never decayed, much like the eternal flow of Bindus's rivers. By offering honey, worshippers sought enduring love, lasting peace, and unbroken family bonds. Milk followed, warm, white, and freshly drawn from goats or cows. Where honey represented the eternal, milk symbolized the mortal. It was the nourishment of infants, the substance that connected mother and child, life and land. When poured into the sacred basin, it mingled with the water, vanishing instantly, a sign that the god had accepted it. Priestesses often dipped their fingers into this mixture, marking the foreheads of the supplicants with 3 white drops, saying, "As milk joins the water, so may your life join the flow of the divine." The most personal offerings were the shells. Polished smooth by the river's own hand, they represented the human soul, shaped, worn, and made beautiful by the current of existence. Women carved their names or initials inside them before placing them in the water, believing that Bindus would remember each one. Sometimes the shells resurfaced days later, carried downstream to another temple, a sign that their prayers had been heard and sent onward. Through these simple rituals, the Illyrians expressed a profound truth. Gratitude sustains the sacred. Theirs was a faith without greed, without sacrifice of life, only the giving of life's sweetness. And so long as honey flowed and milk was poured, the waters of Bindus would never run dry. At the sacred springs of Bindus, amid the song of flowing water and the scent of burning herbs, stood the priestesses, the mortal voices of the river god. These women were not born to their role. They were chosen. Legends say Bindus himself called them in dreams, their names carried by the murmur of the stream. When they awoke, they were marked by a strange calm and a lifelong devotion to the water's rhythm. The priestesses lived near the temples, often in modest dwellings built from stone and reed. Their days began before dawn, when they waded barefoot into the cold water, cupping it in their hands and whispering, "I greet the flowing one." This daily greeting was both prayer and renewal, for to serve Bindus was to live in constant purification. Their hair was never cut, symbolizing the river's endless course, and they adorned themselves not with jewels, but with river shells, copper pendants, and strands of dried juniper. During rituals, the priestesses acted as intermediaries between the people and the god. They performed the offerings, poured honey and milk into the springs, and read the ripples that followed. If the water swirled smoothly, it was a sign of blessing. If it broke sharply or darkened, it warned of imbalance, a coming illness, betrayal, or drought. Their voices, trained in chant, echoed across the water like the song of wind through reeds. But the priestesses were more than spiritual guides. They were healers, midwives, and counselors. Women in labour called for them. Lovers sought their counsel. Warriors visited before battle to cleanse their weapons in the sacred stream. It was said that a priestess could calm storms, bless fields, or draw poison from a wound simply by invoking Bindus's name. Yet their power was bound by humility. They did not command the god. They served as his reflection. When a priestess died, her body was not burned or buried in the earth. Instead, she was placed upon a wooden raft covered in herbs and flowers, and set adrift down the river at dusk. The people watched in silence as the current carried her away, returning her, body and spirit, to the god she had served all her life. for the Illyrians believed those who spoke for the river would one day become part of it forever. Each year, when spring returned and the rivers swelled with melted snow, the Illyrians celebrated the Festival of Flowing Light, a sacred event honouring Bindus and the renewal of life. For 3 nights and 3 days, the temples beside the springs came alive, filled with torches, music, and the laughter of women whose devotion turned worship into celebration. It was said that during these nights, the god himself stirred within the waters, blessing those who danced and sang in his name. The festival began at twilight. As the sun sank behind the hills, priestesses lit oil lamps and placed them on wooden bowls, setting them afloat along the river. Hundreds of tiny flames drifted downstream, their reflections shimmering like stars upon the surface. The Illyrians called it the water's sky, believing the god was guiding each light toward the hearts of his devotees. Women stood along the banks, releasing honey, milk, and flower petals into the current, whispering, "Carry my wish, Bindus, and bring it back fulfilled." As darkness deepened, music filled the air. Drums made from stretched goat hide pulsed like heartbeats, flutes mimicked the call of flowing streams, and dancers moved barefoot through the water. Each motion, every turn, every step, mirrored the rhythm of the river itself. Young girls, crowned with wildflowers, wove garlands to throw into the current, offering them as symbols of first love and renewal. Married women, draped in white linen, prayed for harmony and fertility. At midnight, the priestesses performed the ceremony of reflection. They stood in a circle around the spring, holding bronze mirrors that caught the moonlight and redirected it into the water. The shimmering glow represented the union of sky and river, the eternal bond between divine masculine and feminine. The people believed that to glimpse one's reflection in that illuminated water was to see the soul cleansed and renewed. By dawn, the fires dimmed and the songs softened. The final act of devotion was silence. The worshippers knelt by the river, pressing their palms into the damp earth as the first light touched the water. In that quiet moment, they felt what the Illyrians most revered, the pulse of life itself, eternal, flowing, and divine. To the Illyrians, the springs of Bindus were more than sacred. They were alive, carrying the god's breath through every current. People journeyed for miles to bathe in his waters, seeking healing for both body and soul. The sick, the weary, and the heartbroken all came to the same place, to kneel by the source and surrender their pain to the god who flowed without end. The temples of Bindus were, above all, sanctuaries of renewal. The healing rituals began at dawn, when mist still curled over the surface of the spring. Priestesses would dip bronze cups into the clear water and sprinkle it upon those who came in supplication. The afflicted then stepped into the pool, guided by chants that rose and fell like the tide. The first immersion was for the body, to wash away illness and fatigue. The second was for the mind, to release fear and sorrow. The third, always the most sacred, was for the spirit, a return to balance with the divine rhythm of the world. Herbs played a vital role in these ceremonies. Juniper branches were burned to purify the air, while mint and wormwood were crushed and mixed into the water to awaken the senses. Those suffering from fever or childbirth pains drank a small portion of the spring water, believing it carried the god's essence into their veins. Wounds were washed with it, and even the dying were given a few drops on their lips, as if to carry Bindus's blessing into the afterlife. But healing went beyond the physical. Many came to the waters burdened by grief, widows, abandoned lovers, or those haunted by guilt. The priestesses instructed them to speak their sorrow into a shell and cast it into the current, symbolically releasing it to the god. The water carried away their pain, and in its place came stillness, a sense of being held by something vast and compassionate. Even after Rome's arrival, the legend of the healing springs endured. Locals claimed that the water still shimmered brighter than any other, and those who drank from it spoke of strange dreams, of a voice in the current, gentle yet eternal, whispering, "Flow and be whole again." Though the temples of Bindus have long fallen to ruin, their stones scattered, their bronze idols buried beneath centuries of silt, his presence endures in the living waters of the Balkans. The rivers that once bore his name still wind through valleys and villages, murmuring with the same voice the Illyrians once prayed to. His temples may be silent, but his current remains, patient, eternal, and watching. In many remote regions, echoes of his worship survived long after the old gods were forgotten. Shepherds still pour a drop of milk into a stream before the first grazing of spring. Women still tie red threads near mountain springs, asking for fertility or healing. Even the practice of washing newborns in first water, the clear morning flow untouched by sunlight, comes from the rites of Bindus. The god's faith was never destroyed, it simply transformed, flowing quietly through generations like an underground spring. Archaeologists have found traces of his sanctuaries, circular foundations beside rivers, fragments of offerings, and bronze plaques inscribed with his name. Each discovery feels like a breath resurfacing from deep time, a reminder that the Illyrians once saw the divine not in distant heavens, but in the world around them. Their spirituality was intimate, tactile, and alive, a conversation with the earth itself. Bindus, the god of the rivers, was their proof that divinity could be touched, heard, and felt beneath one's fingertips. Modern visitors who stand by those ancient springs often describe a strange stillness, the kind that hums beneath the surface as if the water remembers. Some claim the light bends differently there, that the air carries a sweetness like honey, that their reflections ripple even when the breeze is still. Whether superstition or memory, the sense of presence endures. In the Illyrian mind, water was the soul of the world, flowing from birth to death and beyond. Bindus was that flow given form. His worshippers are gone, yet every raindrop that strikes the soil, every river that carves through stone, continues his eternal hymn. The god remains, not in temples of marble, but in every living current, the same waters that once listened to the prayers of women and still whisper them back through time.